Obesity increases your risk of hospitalized infections. GLP-1 therapy seems to reduce that risk.
Dr. Samuel Klein is an expert in metabolic health and the Division Chief of Nutritional Science and Obesity Medicine at Washington University in St. Louis.
This is a revolution, as you say. This is like when insulin was discovered.
We know that obesity adversely impacts organ systems throughout the body. But why is that the case? We talk about the mechanisms at play, the gaps in our knowledge, and what the future might hold for obesity medicine and metabolic health.
Fat is not just a fuel reserve that keeps you alive during periods of food deprivation, but it's also an endocrine organ that produces things and regulates metabolic function.
At a time when approximately 40% of adults in the United States are obese, Dr. Klein's work is both timely and urgent.
The only way to lose fat in a healthy way is to eat less than you burn up.
Welcome to Stanford Department of Medicine's Inside Look at the Future of Medicine.
Well, Sam, welcome to Stanford.
Thanks for having me.
And welcome to the Future of Medicine, our podcast here. You just gave a remarkable grand rounds here in honor of one of our faculty, no longer with us, Gerald Reaven, but really the father of metabolic disease. And I know that we're going to talk a little bit about that, but you gave just a tremendous talk. Before we get to some of your work, which I think our listeners will really be interested in, tell us a little about yourself. Like, where did you grow up? How did you first get interested in science and medicine? And what paths did you take? We love the podcast here to talk a little bit about the paths taken and the paths not taken.
Yeah. So I'm born in Philadelphia, first generation American. My parents are immigrants.
Okay.
And so they came to Philadelphia from Europe after the war.
Yeah, whereabouts in Europe?
Poland and Czechoslovakia.
Okay.
The old Czechoslovakia.
Yeah.
That's not the Czech Republic.
Right,
yeah.
right.
And grew up there and became interested in how the body worked and nutrition and metabolism.
So from pretty young age?
Really in college.
In college.
I started.
All right.
And at that time, there's a lot of people writing nutrition books that weren't based on evidence,
right?
Which is still the case.
Yes, that hasn't stopped.
Nutrition is a target for that.
Yeah.
And decided to go to medical school to learn how the body works even better.
Yeah.
And that interest continued through medical school. And from there, I went on to do a residency in internal medicine. And I chose Boston because that was a sort of nutrition hub at the time, and went to graduate school after my residency at MIT for nutritional biochemistry and metabolism.
Yeah.
And then from there, I did a GI fellowship because that's where food enters the body.
Makes sense.
And nutrition. And from there, I had great mentors and great people who trained me, and was interested in fat metabolism because no one was working on it at the time.
Right.
And if you're interested in fat, you eventually become interested in obesity.
Yeah.
And that's how I ended up here.
Great. Wow, we're right. That's a great story. And I mean, nutrition is so central. Like, it's on the front pages of our newspapers. There's lots of books. There's advice everywhere. It seems to change all the time. But we're also in the middle of a metabolic revolution.
Yes.
Triggered mostly by the GLP-1s, which has really made, I think, the work that you've done, your work really provided the foundation and the context for that. But I think there's also, despite that it's now some time since you and originally worked from Gerald Reaven and others demonstrated some of these findings, some of them have still not made them into the general understanding that's out there. So that's what I'd love to pick apart a little bit. Particularly, you showed some really just fascinating data from studies across many, many years, where you show that obesity itself doesn't necessarily mandate that you'll have metabolic compromise. So tell us a little bit, first of all, how that idea came to you and how you decided to pursue that.
Yeah. Well, actually, Gerald Reaven was one of the first to identify that, to show that some people with obesity have normal insulin sensitivity. Insulin is a hormone made by the pancreas, and it's a critical hormone that really regulates metabolic health. And by metabolic health, it means your blood sugar, your blood lipids, your liver health, cardiac health at the same time.
Right.
And found that some people who are obese were really normal insulin sensitivity and healthy, and others who weren't. And the question is, why are some people resistant to the adverse effects of excess body fat, and other people are predisposed? Most people, when you become heavier and gain fat, for some reason, we're trying to figure out why, everything goes bad. In fact, obesity has adverse effects on every single organ system in the body.
Yeah.
And when you lose weight, they all get better.
Right. So that's, I think, what we're used to hearing, right? I think the public, you stop someone in the street, I think they would be able to tell you that. What was surprising, and you said it quite quickly there, was that there's also a group of people who are obese but metabolically healthy.
Yes.
So given all the things we've heard, How does that work? Just pick that apart a little for us.
Yeah, so it means that the mechanisms of why excess body fat causes disease are not working in those people, that they have blocked that.
Yeah.
And so that's the question is, what's the signal from fat tissue, from adipose tissue, that tells other organs to be healthy or unhealthy?
Okay.
And we're trying to figure out why that's the case. We know that excess adipose tissue is bad, but there's a signal from adipose tissue, from fat to other organs. That's really the trick to try to figure out.
Well, so let's go down that path first, because that is, I think, what we all think of and expect. And you had some nice slides also on the idea that fat causes inflammation. That's a very vague term, although we mean it in a very specific way in a medical circle. But I think that it's also a word that's now broken out of its medical boundary, and people talk about inflammatory behavior and inflammatory diets and
inflammatory personality.
Yes, exactly. The whole thing. Yeah. But I think that it's interesting, I think, to just maybe for our listeners just to pick apart a little the mechanisms through which excess body fat can cause unhealthiness first, and then maybe we could revisit this group that somehow seem resistant to that. Yeah.
So it used to be thought, and still is, body fat is a fuel reserve. It's a way you store fuel. It's mostly triglyceride, which is fat, and very little water. You can carry around this gas tank with you wherever you go in a compact form. In fact, the amount of fat you had, it determines how long you live if you don't have any food. And there's a person in the Guinness Book of World Record published who underwent a therapeutic fast, no calories at all, for 382 days, losing more than half of his body weight, 125 kilograms of body weight, without any adverse effects, just drinking acaloric fluids. Wow. But then if you have a thin Irish Republican Army hunger striker, they'll be dead in about 2 months if they don't eat food and only drink fluids. So fat determines how long you live. That's why women live longer than men if there's no food, because they have more body fat than men. But now we learn also that fat is not just a fuel reserve that keeps you alive during periods of food deprivation, but it's also an endocrine organ that produces things that go around to other parts of the body and regulates metabolic function.
Yeah, so it's like a gland that sends things into the circulation that then have an effect on them. And these are measurable molecules. What sort of molecules are we talking about?
Well, one is a molecule called adiponectin, which is healthy, made by adipose tissue and body fat. Another is leptin, which it regulates food intake. So if you have a lot of fat, leptin may go up and may decrease your desire to eat, but that can be dysregulated in people who are obese. And now we're trying to understand what are some of the other things released from body fat that might signal other organs to be unhealthy. And those are things that can be like free fatty acids, which is the breakdown product of triglyceride fat in the adipose tissue, but also maybe a breakdown product of the collagen, the structural framework of adipose tissue. It lives in a structure that houses all those fat cells, or else it would just flop down. So the breakdown of that structure releases some proteins into the blood that can go to other organs and cause harm in those organs. One is called endotrophin.
Yeah, you had some slides about that. And these are pro-inflammatory molecules in general?
So it's not pro-inflammatory, but can cause resistance to the action of insulin.
I see.
And one of insulin's main function is to drive glucose into your cells, into muscle cells, and keep your blood sugar low. If you're resistant to insulin, your blood sugar goes up because it's not being driven into your muscle cells, and also your liver is making too much glucose.
So most of the people out there who are either pre-diabetic, that's a very large group, or frankly diabetic with type 2 diabetes, older, perhaps in the population with type 1, they have insulin resistance.
They have insulin resistance. And so insulin resistance will cause pre-diabetes and then diabetes, but at the same time, you then have to have a defect in your pancreas to make insulin. And so if you don't make an adequate amount of insulin, you can overcome the resistance to insulin by making a lot of insulin. So people who are obese, they have normal glucose because they're making more insulin to counteract the resistance to insulin. But at some point, it can't do it. Can't keep up. And the cells that make the insulin aren't making enough, and your resistance is too high to resist.
Got it.
And then you become abnormal metabolically, and that leads to all kinds of problems.
And they're both, I think, some simpler ways, like through a lipid panel, and some more complicated ways through some very intensive physiology studies you've done for measuring insulin resistance. Tell us about those.
Yes, you can measure insulin resistance by infusing insulin at a physiological normal level that's high.
Yep.
And measure how much glucose you have to infuse into someone to maintain a normal blood sugar. And so if you're very sensitive to insulin, you require a lot of glucose to be infused because your muscle tissues are responding to insulin, taking it up very aggressively.
Right.
If you're very resistant to insulin, you require very little glucose to be infused because you're resistant to insulin and blood sugar goes up. And that's a measure of insulin sensitivity.
So this is one you can measure, but it sounds like for that, of course, someone has to come to your lab and lay on the couch and they're there for a few hours and you're infusing these different things, measuring other things. There's a surrogate for that, I think, isn't there, through a lipid panel, the triglyceride?
Yes. So and Jerry Reaven developed this triglyceride to HDL cholesterol ratio.
Right.
That ratio can help determine who's insulin resistant or not, because insulin is also involved in regulating blood lipids. And so having a high triglyceride, low HDL cholesterol is very common in people who are insulin resistant. And the resistance to insulin makes you increase the fat in your liver because it stimulates the production of fat in the liver. And so if you're resistant to it, you increase fat in your liver, and that might be driving the triglyceride that goes into your bloodstream.
Got it.
By the fat in your liver releasing those triglycerides into the bloodstream.
Yeah. And this work you showed where essentially that fat is sitting there as like an additional organ, sending maybe some good things, but mostly bad things out into the circulation, causing insulin resistance. I think that's the right model for people to have in their minds. What was fascinating, though, is you have these great studies you showed about with liposuction.
Yep.
So I think there were some early studies, perhaps, that came from the liposuction community that suggested the metabolic health might improve after that. But that's not what you've found.
Yeah, it's really fascinating because we know if you reduce body fat by eating less calories than you burn up, dieting, bariatric surgery, GLP-1, medications, your insulin sensitivity and metabolic health improves. But if you remove the body fat by sucking it out with liposuction or cutting it out, you don't improve your metabolic health. And so what happens is when you reduce your fat by liposuction, you remove billions of fat cells from the body. But the fat cells
like 20 pounds.
Exactly. But the fat cells that remain stay large. They stay in adipose tissue that's unhealthy, and you don't do anything to the fat that's inside of other organs, like in the liver and muscle tissue, which causes insulin resistance in those organs. So the only way to lose fat in a healthy way is to eat less than you burn up.
Right, and we'll definitely come back to that. You also had talked a little bit, which I thought was fascinating, about the difference between fat that's sort of on the outside of the body and visceral fat, in other words, fat in and around our organs. Including a surgical study, which I thought was sort of amazed at, where surgeons would just go in and chop out a bunch of fat from inside your abdominal cavity. Tell us what we learned from those studies.
Yeah, so we know that most of your fat is underneath your skin, called subcutaneous fat. So 80% of people who are obese, 80% of the fat in your body, if you're obese, is underneath your skin. 15% or so is inside of your abdomen. In lean people, 95% is under your skin, and about 5% of the fat in your body is inside your abdomen. The fat inside your abdomen is correlated with metabolic disease, diabetes, heart disease, triglyceride, insulin resistance, but doesn't mean it's a cause. It means it's associated. Just like if you have pancreatic cancer, you might be jaundiced, you'll be yellow, but being yellow isn't the cause of your illness, it's the cancer. That's the cause. So Nadia Bumrad at Vanderbilt actually removed a chunk of visceral fat surgically, the omentum, which is about a third of your visceral fat.
Just like a blanket that kind of sits on top of your intestine.
Apron. It hangs down from the large intestine. Just snip it right out. It takes about 10 minutes to do the procedure, and found that had no beneficial effect in improving insulin sensitivity in people with type 2 diabetes. It did not improve their blood glucose. So sucking fat out from underneath your skin, subcutaneous fat, and removing fat by cutting it out of inside your abdomen doesn't seem to be beneficial. You have to eat less than you burn up in order to get the beneficial effects of fat loss.
Well, that makes sense. So I mean, this is, I think, leads us inevitably to talk about, must be your common, it's everybody's dinner table conversation, it seems, at some point, but it must be your everyday, it must be your breakfast, lunch, and dinner conversation.
People actually don't like to talk about it during meals.
Is that right? Yeah. But we're in this new world now with these GLP-1 medications and really a whole host of follow-ons, and everyone has heard of now or probably knows people, and when we think of the percentage of the country that would appear to have tried them, weight management as a category of drugs that are available is now here, and a decade ago, of course, that wasn't clear, even though the science is decades old. How's that changed your world, and what have you learned from that revolution?
Yeah, this is a revolution, as you say. This is like when insulin was discovered, when antibiotics were discovered. Yeah. This is huge, because this really regulates food intake, and it's just the beginning.
Right.
In 10 years, there'll be a whole slew of newer, more potent, with less side effect, drugs as well.
Yeah.
But it shows that now that you can help people lose weight by taking a medication when other medications in the past were not very effective, and you had to rely on bariatric surgery to get significant weight loss. Now you can get that weight loss with these medications.
Yeah.
And it's caused dramatic improvements in people's health. And there might be some weight loss independent benefits of GLP-1 drugs, like on the heart.
Yes.
And you're a cardiologist.
That's right.
And so there's weight loss independent effects where you get beneficial effects of these weight loss medications before you lose that much weight.
Yeah.
That you reduce the risk of heart attacks and cardiac
the studies where they matched the weight loss, the patients who also took the drugs as well as lost the weight actually did better from a cardiac, which I'm not sure was expected. I think that's part of what's interesting here.
It was a surprise, and the curves diverged.
Yeah.
The side effects of cardiac effects in people with high risk that took placebo, at 6 months they started to spread apart. 6 months of therapy, you started to get beneficial effects on the heart before much weight loss.
Right. Yeah, remarkable. And then we've seen some of the data, still unclear, but in relation to neurological disorders, but also, of course, addiction disorders.
Yes.
Really quite interesting. Yeah. We had Anna Lemke recently here on the podcast.
Yes.
And so we find lots of reasons to talk about GLP-1s, but there's probably nobody we've had or talked to whose world is probably more changed by the advent of these medications. I'm really just fascinated by whether, I certainly didn't see this coming, even although, again, the science was decades old. You were much closer to it. Did you see it come?
No, this was really unexpected. This is pretty fast. 87 GLP-1s were first identified.
Right.
And then 20 years later, boom, it's, having amazing effects. And I think it was really, it was being used to treat diabetes.
Right. The early ones were short-acting diabetes medications, and they've come and gone off patent.
Yes, right. And then they increased the dose to get better diabetes therapy, and it turned out it caused a lot of weight loss.
Yeah.
And then that hit a light bulb, and I said,
there might be
something else,
some value to be gained.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and then
because these drugs stimulate the secretion of insulin,
right,
and so that's why it was developed for diabetes therapy, and it wasn't developed because it causes weight loss.
Right. That was really a secondary phenomenon. And I think when I initially heard of it, the thought was always, it causes nausea, that's why it causes weight loss. But I think it's only as we've done the studies we realized that, first of all, it really does cause this weight loss, pretty dramatic for many people, but also appears to have these other benefits, food noise, addiction, with other substances, and then also potentially neuromuscular disease, cardiovascular disease. And not everything that can be connected directly to obesity.
Yes.
I think you said that at the beginning.
Even infection.
Yeah, infections.
People taking GLP-1, obesity increases your risk of hospitalized infections. GLP-1 therapy seems to reduce that risk.
Yeah, that's remarkable.
Yeah.
And so I'd love to draw a line then, understanding, more fat in general bad, less fat in general good. But you've done this fascinating work with a group who are obese and yet are metabolically healthy. And you started to think about and show some data to try and explain why that might be. But tell us a little about that work.
Yeah, so that's really the key question, because obesity is a heterogeneous disease. It's a real spectrum, like all diseases. But at the two ends are people that are obese and healthy, and people that are obese and unhealthy.
Right.
Unhealthy meaning pre-diabetes, type 2 diabetes.
High blood pressure.
High liver fat content. And those are most of the people that get those abnormalities. So why are the small percentage of people with obesity do not have those diseases? So that's what we've been looking at. And it turns out that they have different adipose tissue biology. that their adipose tissue seems to be different than people that have unhealthy obesity. And that difference in biology is what we're trying to understand better. They secrete things that are different or less of than the people who have unhealthy obesity. And they secrete some things that actually can be healthy and beneficial compared to the people who have unhealthy obesity.
So do you think it's the secretome, if you like, if we call it that, like the secreted molecules from the fat that are key to its unhealthiness rather than just the fact it exists?
It has to be, because how does the fat communicate to other organs?
Right.
Having bad fat is meaningless unless somehow it tells other organs it's bad or good. And it's got to be a communication system, which is really a hormonal type of system that communicates with other organs. And that's the key, is trying to understand what those mechanisms are, because if you understand them better, you can develop therapies to break the link between excess body fat and unhealthy obesity and metabolic health.
But there are some people who have plenty of fat, but it's not signaling in a bad way, and they're metabolically more healthy.
And they tend to be women. Very hard to find men who are metabolically healthy. Tend to be women with lower body fat distribution. These are women with large hips, large buttocks, large legs. They tend to, and not such a large waist circumference. And they tend to be the ones with metabolically healthy obesity.
Really interesting. I'd love to go back to the inflammation question, just because, again, it's so much in the public domain. You have also measured some pro-inflammatory elements. So what are your findings there?
So our findings actually go against the dogma of many people, in that inflammation, meaning increased immune cells, as well as increased expression of genes that are pro-inflammatory, are increased in people with unhealthy obesity. But then what's that communication to other organs that's really key? And we found that the proteins that come out of these adipose tissues from unhealthy people that are supposed to be pro-inflammatory and causing metabolic harm in other organs are not different in concentration than healthy obesity, except for some. And one of the major ones is plasminogen activating inhibitor.
PI1.
PI1. You're a cardiologist, you know. So PI1 is very important in the cardiology field because of thrombosis and blood clots. And now we're appreciating it's also a very important metabolic hormone that regulates insulin sensitivity. And as I mentioned before, if you have a deficiency in producing PI1 genetically, you have a lower risk of getting diabetes and heart disease than people that have normal PI1 production.
So, I mean, it's fascinating. And one of the questioners at the end of your talk kind of asked this question, which I was also interested to ask you here, which is, a lot of people will be listening thinking, well, which one am I? Am I one of the metabolically healthy ones, or am I not? And does that mean I don't need to exercise, or maybe I don't need a GLP-1? Give us a sense of, if someone going to their doctor, can they get a sense of that by measuring something? And if they can, what should they do? I mean, we should all eat a bit better and exercise more, but how can your work inform really kind of precision medicine?
The first thing is just what you look like. If you have a large waist, a beer belly, then you're more prone to have unhealthy obesity. If you have large hips and legs and not that much of a belly, and you're a woman, you're much more likely to be healthy obese. And then a doctor's regular blood test exam, triglyceride levels, HDL cholesterol, blood glucose, and even a blood pressure will all identify people that are metabolically unhealthy. And Gerald Reaven described this early on as the syndrome X, which is now called the metabolic syndrome, meaning you have these abnormalities that's on a routine clinical exam by your physician can identify who's at risk. But we know the cut points. This is all a heterogeneous, like a glucose level is heterogeneous, with a range, and we make these artificial cut points of what's normal, what's abnormal. So even high normal is unhealthy to these things. So a high normal blood pressure is unhealthy compared to a lower blood pressure, and a high normal glucose, like a glucose of 90, is not as healthy as a glucose of 75 on your blood test.
How about the HbA1c? People may have heard of that. This is sort of the long-term glycated hemoglobin, but the sort of, if you like, ultimate test for where your glucose level has been over the course of several weeks that doctors will often do.
Another important measurement, and that might become part of the routine clinical exam, as well, because a high hemoglobin A1c also determines your being healthy or unhealthy obesity, and having a normal cut point is not really, 5.6 or lower is not so normal unless you're down around 5. or 5.1. So the high normal in that range is also not so healthy.
Yeah. What do you make of this? I was having a discussion about this recently with someone. We are in medicine, we always have our 95% confidence interval, or our population norm. And depending on the lab, that may be derived from thousands of patients, but often it's quite a small number for certain assays. Yeah. And it's a population norm, but that population is never particularly well stated, and it's probably not that diverse. There's been some work recently suggesting that your own normal, like measured over the course of several years, might be a better guide. And speaking as someone without a completely normal HbA1c, I was sort of looking at that and wondering, if I'd had measurements in my 20s and 30s and 40s, and they were all the same as my measurement today, is that truly meaningful versus where I am on a scale of a population? How do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think you have to think about it as obesity-related metabolic diseases, cardiometabolic diseases, are a constellation of diseases that track together.
Right.
And so if you have one abnormality, but everything else is good, you're not at the same risk as someone who has that same abnormality, but they also have these other abnormalities at the same time. Yeah. So if you're a runner and healthy and fit, and you have a little bit of a high hemoglobin A1C, but your triglycerides are low, your HDL is high, LDL cholesterol is
describing me now.
It's not the same as someone with high hemoglobin A1C that has those other risk factors. And what we often do is we focus on these individual organs instead of the multi-organ system compendium, which really determines your health.
Yeah. Well, you touched on this. One of our new programs here in the Department of Medicine at Stanford is thinking about metabolism, because it does touch on so many of our, I guess, historically divided subspecialties, but in reality it touches on all of them. And so we've been really interested to bring together a group of researchers and clinicians who are all focused on metabolic disease and who can practice together, literally see patients in the same building, but also do research together regardless of whether they're primarily a fat cell person or a macrophage person or a vascular biologist. I'm hoping you approve of that model.
Yeah, in fact, I'm really so much supportive of that, as chairman doing this, you're a visionary.
Oh, you're too kind.
Because this is really the way things should go, because people are organ systems. They're not individual organs.
Yes.
You're not a liver, I'm not a heart. And they go together, and the treatments are also often the same for all the different organs. Yeah. So putting them together and tracking that and being able to put the best treatment forward, individualized for each person's issues and problems, and adding exercise to
really
the mix as well, which is often overlooked, is critical to addressing this. And then having a clinical population like that with whom you can do research is really a real benefit to really advance the future. I think it's a great idea, and every medical school should do that, except the ones that are near you, to avoid the competition.
Absolutely. Well, Sam, I think you're describing the future of medicine. Thank you so much for spending time with us today and doing Grand Rounds. I appreciate you joining us.
My pleasure.
The preceding program is copyrighted by the Board of Trustees of the Leland Stanford Junior University. Please visit us at med.stanford.edu.